Alexander Shkudun. The playa. The small round room with a single window, covered by heavy blinds, was stifling. Cigar smoke curled upward, forming thick clouds that spread in different directions, enveloping the already struggling electric light bulb. The air was stale, reeking of sweat and strong alcohol. Four men sat around a circular table, nervously glancing at each other, holding their cards tightly. None of them wanted to make a wrong move and be forced out of the game, where the stakes had already reached $140,000. Chuck, a well-groomed man with neatly styled hair, looked at the player to his right, raising an inquisitive eyebrow. The one he addressed frowned. He lifted a glass of Armenian cognac and downed it in one gulp. His coal-black eyes darted anxiously, scanning the other players. From the depths of his tweed jacket, which fit snugly over his bulky frame, Chuck pulled out a worn handkerchief and dabbed at his sweaty forehead.
Decide, Chuck.
A blond man with sharp cheekbones and a scar running from his right ear down to his neck called out from across the table. He was an unpleasant-looking fellow. His face resembled a grotesque mask from a horror store, and his eyes betrayed the soul of a ruthless killer.
A fold.
Chuck muttered, tossing his cards onto the table face down, exhaling deeply as if relieved after closing a risky deal. He had just saved his money. 3 players remained. A tense silence hovered over the table. Somewhere in the distance, a fly buzzed annoyingly, but no one paid it any attention.
Tony.
The blonde smirked predatorily, studying his opponent intently.
I think another $2,000 will only make the pot more interesting. I raised to 150.
Tony declared. Tony was the complete opposite of Chuck. He had a well-trimmed mustache and a thick mane of hair, always slicked back with brilliantine, styled according to the latest fashion. A perfectionist in everything, he meticulously maintained his appearance, frequented the gym, and was extremely picky with women. Despite them flocking to him in droves, deep down, he wasn't a gambler. Like the blonde man, he simply loved money.
Patrick?
Both players turned their gazes toward the third man left in the game. He was a mystery other than his name, the only standard question allowed at these meetings. Nothing else was known about him. He was young and seemed inexperienced, yet he had parted with his initial $20,000 stake like a professional, casually tossing the money onto the table.
I raised to 200.
The young man said. His voice did not match his appearance. He looked about 25, slim, with full lips and honey-colored eyes. He wore worn-out jeans and a red linen shirt. Neither his look nor his demeanor suggested he was a man of wealth. Tony snorted. I should keep a close eye on him if this kid can't cover his bets. Not that it was an issue. A bouncer was stationed downstairs, capable of squeezing any sum out of any loser, and if the kid had any sense, he would understand this perfectly.
Okay, kid.
The blond man, known as Bud, fished a stack of bills out of his back pocket.
Another $10,000.
You guys are playing small.
Tony sneered.
Let's raise the stakes. This isn't a casual game.
He picked up a brown crocodile leather briefcase from the floor, unclasped it, and after a few seconds laid a portion of its contents on the table.
It's $150,000, gentlemen.
He smirked.
I'm raising the stakes by another $150,000.
Chuck, who had been sitting in a relaxed posture all this time, stiffened and let out a whistle. The pot was now $360,000. Bud loosened his tie and rubbed his cheeks. His gaze moved from Tony to Patrick. If this guy wasn't bluffing, there was a huge fortune to be won. Bud licked his dry lips. Patrick was deep in thought. This is it. A chance to win an enormous amount of money, to become fabulously rich in just one evening. He looked at his cards. His chances were decent, pretty good, actually. Think, man, think, he told himself. Should I swap 2 cards, change my whole hand, or keep it as it is and hope for luck? Then again, luck alone won't be enough here. Tony was beginning to feel uneasy. Did I raise too early, he wondered? Should I have waited until at least one of them folded? He wasn't worried about Bud for some reason, but something about this strange kid unsettled him. A vague suspicion gnawed at his mind. There's something off about this guy. I've been playing for years and I've never seen anyone like him. He's too confident. to relax. That smug smirk on his face doesn't look like a bluff. I need to be careful. It's going to come down to him and me, Tony decided. He poured himself another glass of cognac and drank it straight without a chaser. The tension was rising. The second hand of the clock hanging on the wall opposite the poker table had crossed the number 12 3 times. Bad drummed his fingers on the table. Tony was trying to read his opponent's minds but failed. For some reason, Patrick was studying Chuck's face. His honey-colored eyes scrutinized the heavy-set man who had left the game too early.
Are we going to sit here until morning?
Tony finally broke the silence.
If no one wants to raise the stakes, the winnings are mine.
He didn't really expect a response. He just wanted to break the tension and mask his growing uncertainty.
Don't rush.
Bod spat out the stub of his extinguished cigar, took a new one from a golden case, lit it, and took a drag.
Don't rush, Tony.
He unzipped a bag next to his chair and pulled out stacks of bills.
150,000. To be honest, I had other plans for these little ones, but since you're offering me the chance to win even more, why not?
The money landed in the center of the table.
What do you say, kid?
Both Bad and Tony turned to Patrick.
Are you in or are you folding?
Patrick thoughtfully rubbed the bridge of his nose. His brain was working overtime. It's entirely possible that these two have an agreement to split the winnings, leaving me with nothing. Well, let's see. He gave a knowing smile, lifted his sweater to reveal a money belt underneath, pulled out the required sum, and casually tossed it onto the table as if it were nothing more than scraps of an old magazine.
All right, let's show our hands.
Tony laughed triumphantly, masking his chuckle as a cough. Bad shrugged. Patrick remained silent. All right, then, let's reveal our cards. Tony picked up his first card and, savoring the moment, began to place it on the table.
Wait.
Chuck's voice made Tony flinch, nearly dropping the card. He stared at Chuck in surprise, then looked at the other two players, equally puzzled.
Hold on, don't rush. I have a little bet to propose.
Chuck's usual foolishly ironic expression disappeared. Now his face exuded mystery and melancholy. The sweat on his forehead had dried, and his legs, which had been twitching under the table all this time, now stood firmly in place. Bad frowned, calculating something in his head. Patrick relaxed. He was right. Chuck had left the game too early, and now, it seemed, he was stepping back in.
Don't bet, Patrick.
Chuck's gaze swept over the players.
There are $660,000 on the table.
Thanks, we can count.
Bad grumbled irritably.
Calm down, gentlemen. As I said, I have a wager for you.
Chuck grinned eerily, revealing his yellowed, cigarette-stained teeth.
Since I've left the game, I have no right to claim this money, but...
The clock's ticking echoed like a hammer against their ears. Everyone turned into a bundle of nerves. Even the fly buzzing near the window went silent.
But
Chuck repeated, raising his index finger.
there's a cheat among us.
It was a bombshell. Tony nearly jumped out of his seat. Bad clutched his cards to his chest in fear, while Patrick's face changed slightly. Now, his eyes held curiosity. The game had taken a different turn, not the one he had anticipated. Something was happening, something unpleasant.
Yes, there's a first-class cheat at this table.
Chuck was all politeness.
He will win this game and take all the money. No matter what you have in your hands, he will always have more.
Chuck slowly pulled out a cigarette and lit it. He poured some cognac into his half-empty glass and leaned closer to the table.
And I know who he is.
There was no need to clarify who he was. Everyone immediately understood. Patrick stared at Chuck without blinking, biting his lip.
I'm offering each of you a chance to win. I will step into the next room. Anyone who wishes can come talk to me one-on-one and receive a hint on how to win. The hint will depend on the amount of money you offer. The more you pay, the better the advice. Let me remind you, $660,000 are at stake. And you know, the cheat will be quite pleased to walk away with all the money without even trying.
Chuck smoothly pushed away from the table, heaved his hefty body from the chair, and slowly waddled toward the next room, puffing on his cigarette like a small locomotive. When the door closed behind him, the three remaining players exchanged silent glances.
He's bluffing.
Tony took a sip of cognac from his glass and angrily crushed his cigarette butt into the ashtray.
That bastard is trying to make money off us. He couldn't win at the table, so now he's playing tricks. And what a trick. Calling someone a cheat. Ridiculous. I say we finish the game and part ways peacefully.
Bad rubbed his chin.
I don't know, Tony. That Chuck was pretty convincing. What do we really know about him? For that matter, what do we know about each other? This is the first time we've sat at the same table. If he's right and one of us is a cheat, then this game isn't fair, and we have every right to play by the same rules. By asking Chuck for a tip, at least that would level the playing field.
Patrick was thinking. The hint will depend on the amount of money you offer. So simple. You hand over your cash for advice that may not even be true, and then after losing, you're left wondering where the hell Chuck disappeared with your money. And of course, he can always claim that someone else offered him more. The young man clasped his hands together and placed them on the table in front of him.
Whatever Chuck is offering, I refuse to have anything to do with him.
He declared. Tony and Bad exchanged nervous glances. Patrick could clearly see the thought flashing like lightning through their primitive minds. He's the cheat,
I'm going, bud.
Tony said in a hoarse, anxious voice.
I'll be right back.
Clutching his cards tightly to his chest, he grabbed his leather briefcase and headed toward the closed door.
Poor fool.
Patrick shook his head sympathetically and settled in to wait. If these idiots are willing to hand Chuck money for some so-called hint that will supposedly lead them to victory, well, that's their business. Bad, however, was a sight to behold. His face had grown gaunt, his eyes had dulled, and his lips were whispering something under his breath. Minute by minute, his former confidence was slipping away. The money lay in the center of the table. The thought of grabbing it all and knocking Patrick out had crossed Bad's mind for the second time, but he kept dismissing it, knowing that if he did, his reputation would be ruined. Sure, Mike, the bouncer downstairs, would probably let him through for a bribe, but no club would ever take him again, and $500,000 wasn't worth it. He suspected that Patrick had similar thoughts, but apparently he too found reasons against such a move. 5 minutes passed. Bad opened a new bottle of cognac. He was incredibly nervous. His hands trembled. Sweat poured down his forehead. Is the kid really not worried at all? Bad thought, studying Patrick. Does he know more than he's letting on? The young man sat composed and unshaken. His posture was upright, elbows slightly spread, and his eyes reflected complete indifference to what was happening. Bad looked away and let his thoughts wander in another direction. I wonder how much Tony is offering Chuck for a tip. Could a card switch be arranged? But that was unlikely. Each card had a special club stamp visible only under ultraviolet light. Forging it was impossible. Any attempt at tampering was punished harshly, first with a $500,000 fine, and on the second attempt, with permanent exclusion from the game. His inner anxiety grew.
But are you all right?
Patrick asked after a moment.
Shut your damn mouth, you little rat.
Bad snapped.
And remember, I'm watching you very closely. Got it? Try pulling any tricks, and you'll regret it fast.
Patrick just shrugged. This was exactly what he hated, players losing control. It never led to anything good. This is bad. Bad's nerves were nearing the breaking point. His eyes darted around the room, unable to focus on any one object for long. The muscles in his jaw twitched.
Where the hell is he?
Bad suddenly shouted, slamming his fist onto the table. As if on cue, the door to the next room creaked open, and Tony stepped out beaming. He strode confidently back to the table and sank smoothly into his seat.
Sorry to keep you waiting. Shall we continue?
Bad shot up from his chair like a gust of wind, grabbing his bag as he practically leapt toward the waiting Chuck behind the partition.
Nerves of steel, huh?
Tony winked at Patrick and smiled, friendly, sincere, as if he had just received a dose of pure heroin.
Interesting guy, that Chuck.
He went on, pulling a gold cigarette case from his breast pocket and selecting a Cuban cigar. His movements were smooth and deliberate, which only unsettled Patrick further. What the hell happened behind that door? Meanwhile, Tony neatly snipped the end of his cigar with a pair of miniature scissors, placed it between his lips, and retrieved a diamond-encrusted lighter from his pocket. He lit up.
I was just thinking, what do you do with that much money?
Tony nodded toward the stacks of bills.
Buy a yacht? Doubt my wife would approve. Maybe an island, somewhere in the Pacific, with some natives thrown in. What do you think?
Patrick was deep in thought. I don't like this, not one bit. Did that old fool open Tony's eyes and make some sort of deal with him? But how? The cards are already in play. Sure, you can swap a few of them once, but that's not enough to change everything, and card switching won't work. So, what's left? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. Then why does Tony look like he already owns the winnings? Patrick closed his eyes, calmed down. Every game came with its share of stress. Adrenaline surged through his veins, bringing a rush of pleasure. But how many nerve cells burned out in exchange? Pull yourself together, he commanded himself. Everything's fine. This isn't a trap. These opponents will play as expected. You're a player. Finally, after about 3 minutes, Bad returned. His face was that of an unshakable colonel, but his eyes gleamed with greed, and his lips curled into a winner's smile. Where had his nervous breakdown gone? Just minutes ago he had been radiating anxiety, but now he looked completely at ease. Bad took his seat and with exaggerated politeness, offered his companion some cognac. Tony, now pale, declined. Patrick, lost in thought, ignored the offer. His gaze shifted to Tony. The golden boy looked like he'd sell his soul to know what Chuck had told Bad. Decide, Patty, decide. Patrick suddenly recalled his father's words spoken every time his son faced a major life choice: what college to attend, where to work, where to chase his ambitions. The slightly open door across the room seemed to call to him. It pulled him in, like a fallen meteorite attracting NASA scientists. Patrick glanced at Tony's leather briefcase and Bad's bag, as if he could somehow gauge how much cash had already made its way into Chuck's pockets. This is a comedy, an absolute farce. Chuck played them beautifully, probably told them something like, "Everything's going great, you have more than anyone else. Don't worry, you're bound to win. Trust me, I know." Patrick could vividly picture Chuck's fleshy face, winking conspiratorially at his latest victim. But what if he didn't?
Patrick,
Tony raised an eyebrow.
Decide, kid.
Bad chuckled, shuffling his cards. These two were too sure of their victory. In all the games Patrick had played, no opponent had ever been this confident and arrogant. There was always a trace of doubt, a sliver of uncertainty, a flicker of suspicion. Don't be a fool. Act. Patrick slowly rose from the table. With measured steps, he moved toward the slightly open door. Bod and Tony whispered something behind him, but he didn't hear them. All of his focus was on his next move, predicting what awaited him in the next room. Stepping over the threshold and closing the door behind him, Patrick froze. In the small room, with walls cracked by time, he saw something utterly fantastic, something beyond belief. At its very center, as if mirroring the neighboring hall, stood a gaming table. Seated around it were 3 men: himself, Bad, and Tony. Patrick stood in place, blinking in astonishment. A quiet cough came from the left. With difficulty, he tore his gaze away from the players and looked to the side. Against the opposite wall, in a massive leather armchair with a cigar in one hand and a satisfied, smug grin, one leg crossed over the other, sat Chuck.
A wise decision, kid, very wise.
What? What is this?
Patrick asked, his voice hoarse from shock.
This is your chance to win.
Chuck laughed. Seeing the boy's confusion, he removed the cigar from his mouth and explained,
I don't know who created this or why. I don't know how it's possible, but everything here happens exactly as it does in the other room, except for one crucial difference. Time here moves much slower.
Patrick remained silent. He stared at the 3 players at the table. There was Tony taking a sip of cognac before repeating his phrase.
he's bluffing.
Hey, I don't know, Tony. That Chuck was pretty convincing.
Bad said.
What do we really know about him?
Patrick stood in stunned disbelief. It was all happening exactly as it had in the other room 20 minutes ago.
They can't see or hear you.
Chuck's voice reached him.
You can walk up to each of them and look at their cards.
So that's how Chuck knew That's the secret tip he was charging money for, so he's the cheat. But there's one catch: whoever pays the most wins. But why pay at all if I can just look at their hands? Go through the deck and calculate all possible combinations in case they decide to swap cards? No need to pay at all. As if reading his mind, Chuck reached into the inner pocket of his jacket and pulled out a tiny lady's revolver. The black barrel of the miniature gun pointed directly at Patrick's face.
This is just insurance in case you try peeking at the cards without paying.
Chuck smiled.
The revolver is silent and fires needle-thin bullets. If you take even a single step, I'll have to test it on you. But I really don't want to do that.
Chuck spread his arms in mock regret.
Just tell me how much you're willing to pay for my help, and I'll decide what to offer in return. No tricks, no deception. I'm a man of my word. Whoever pays the most gets the whole jackpot.
Patrick said nothing. He stood tall, squared his shoulders, and stared straight into the barrel of the gun.
Seriously, Pat, no tricks.
Chuck's confidence wavered as he caught the strange glint in Patrick's eyes.
The bullets are laced with a slow-acting poison. You'll have enough time to finish the game, maybe even win. Enough time to take the money and go home. But after that...
Chuck trailed off dramatically and let out an exaggerated sniffle, pretending to hold back tears.
There's no antidote.
Ahead, the three continued their game. Any moment now, Tony would leave to get his tip. I wonder how that will look. Will he just walk straight into the wall?
Again, I don't want that to happen.
Chuck said with a conciliatory smile.
So, how much are you willing to offer me?
He asked, savoring the boy's hesitation. Patrick shifted his gaze from the gun to Chuck's face. His eyes were laughing.
Not a cent.
Chuck coughed, choking on his smoke. He pounded his chest with a fist and cleared his throat.
What did you say?
I'm a player, and I'll play till the end.
Suit yourself, kid. Suit yourself.
Patrick turned and grabbed the door handle.
Congratulations on your loss.
Chuck laughed after him. Patrick pushed open the door and stepped back into the main room. Almost nothing had changed. The only difference was that his opponents' faces had turned a shade redder, evidence of the considerable amount of cognac they had consumed.
Oh, here comes Patrick.
Tony smiled, spreading his arms in a cheerful greeting.
We've been waiting for you. Time to wrap up the game and walk away with a fat stack of cash in our pockets.
He winked at Bud and chuckled. Patrick smirked. Of course, they were dying of curiosity about what he had done in that room and how he would act now. He slowly walked to his chair and sat down with the same joyful expression.
Just one.
And he carefully set aside one of his cards on the edge of the table and drew a new one from the deck.
2.
Bud said curtly, drawing 2 cards from the deck. How predictable, Patrick thought to himself with irony. Tony likely had more than him and Bud, even after swapping 2 cards. No doubt he had studied the entire deck and handed Chuck a handsome sum for the privilege. But then again, what was the point in speculating? He had no intention of playing by their rules anyway. The second hand on the clock hanging on the wall continued its slow, steady march. The 3 players sat in tense silence, exchanging meaningful glances, trying to mask their growing excitement. A fortune was on the line, one they had already mentally spent.
Patrick, what's your move? Keeping your hand or swapping any cards?
Tony asked, striving to sound casual and polite.
Thanks. I'll stick with what I have.
Wonderful.
Bud exclaimed, giving himself away entirely. So he knows everything. That means he paid Chuck at least as much as Tony did. Patrick shook his head.
Time to show our hands, gentlemen.
Tony exhaled.
As you wish.
Bud agreed easily. Patrick laid his cards down first.
20.
Not bad, kid.
Tony whistled, grinning slyly.
Not bad at all.
But inside he was rejoicing.
Sorry, gentlemen, but you lost 21.
Bud slammed his cards onto the table.
How do you like that?
He awkwardly wiggled in his chair, rubbing his hands together and grinning from ear to ear. Patrick shook his head again but said nothing. Meanwhile, Bud had already started unzipping his bag, preparing to pack away his winnings.
Not so fast, dear friend.
Tony sneered.
Don't be in such a hurry to meet your maker if you still have unfinished business on this one.
Slowly, deliberately, he revealed his cards, one by one. Bud's smile vanished instantly. It was as if a sack of bricks had been dropped on him. On the table lay one of the rarest hands in the history of the game. Full hand, a combination of a queen, king, and ace of hearts, a hand that crushed 21 into dust.
You cheat.
Bud roared, leaping from his chair.
No one can fool me. You'll pay for this.
With lightning-fast precision, he yanked a ballpoint pen from his breast pocket and aimed it at Tony. Patrick needed only a second to realize what it was. A shot rang out. Tony let out a sharp cry, turning pale with terror and diving to the floor. A moment earlier, Patrick had made the same swift and precise movement, knocking Bud's exotic weapon aside. Footsteps thundered up the staircase and Mike burst into the room. The 2-meter-tall brute, despite his massive frame, moved with alarming speed. He took less than a fraction of a second to assess the situation. Then, his muscular arm grabbed Bud and gave him a violent shake. The man now looked like a pathetic cat being lifted by the scruff of the neck.
You'll never play again. I'll personally make sure of that. The Players Guild does not forgive actions like this. You're going to regret this for the rest of your miserable life.
Mike twisted his face into a menacing grimace and dragged Bud out of the room, making sure to take his bag along.
Are you all right?
Patrick leaned over Tony, who was curled up on the floor, frightened to death.
Yes, thank you.
The man said, slowly rising to his feet, using the table for support.
Great game.
Patrick smiled, trying to reassure his terrified former opponent.
Thank you, you played well too.
Tony finally steadied himself. He patted his pockets, pulled out a handkerchief, and wiped his forehead. Then he sank into his chair, stuck a cigar between his teeth, and let out a heavy sigh. After a brief pause, he said,
I don't even know how to thank you. You saved my life.
Forget it. I don't need anything.
Patrick replied.
Just make sure you live your life well from now on.
Tony nodded repeatedly. His gaze drifted to the stacks of $100 bills still lying on the table. $660,000? He reached out and counted out 100,000, sliding the bundle toward Patrick.
It's the least I can do for you.
Patrick didn't argue. He simply said thank you and carefully tucked the dollar bills into his money belt. They sat in the stuffy room for another half hour, talking. Mostly Tony spoke, enjoying the taste of his Cuban cigar and sharing his plans for his winnings. Patrick didn't interrupt. He understood that a man who had just stared death in the face desperately needed a conversation partner. When the shock had finally worn off, Tony remembered his urgent affairs. He quickly packed up, stuffed his winnings into his briefcase, wished Patrick all the best, and left. Patrick was alone in the small, smoke-filled room. He stood before a massive mirrored window that stretched across the far wall of a spacious office, gazing out at the city. From the 33rd floor, the vast metropolis looked miniature, toy-like. Small streets, streams of cars and pedestrians flowing along them. The world hadn't changed at all. It still followed the laws of others, bowing to the strongest. It absorbed all the best, building on the experiences of past generations. Yet, it remained nothing more than a big child. The world had learned to distinguish good from evil, but it had never granted people the right to choose which side to take. It created both the good and the bad. Patrick turned back toward the wide oak desk standing by the window. Above its surface, a small globe spun slowly. Planet Earth, the fifth planet where he had played his game. A planet where greed and the desire to get rich without much effort still thrived. A planet where avarice triumphed over reason, keeping it from joining the Cosmic Alliance. It lay in an isolated zone closed off from other races, a zone of heightened danger, which suited him just fine. Patrick recalled his first arrival on Earth. By sheer coincidence, during a hyperspace jump, he had entered the wrong coordinates into his ship's navigation system. But as it turned out, the mistake was well worth it. It had taken him precisely 3 days to study the planet, its systems, and to establish his small business. Finding a suitable location and installing a time-collapsed room, a technology still unknown to Earthlings. Choosing a partner recruiting Chuck had been easy. The man knew card games well and played fair. Tonight's game test had been solid proof of that. Of course, Chuck had never seen his real face. His face, Patrick sighed. How many identities had he changed over all these years of the game? From scrawny, insecure young men to thick-skinned businessmen with mayonnaise instead of brains. How many personas had to be carefully crafted down to the smallest details to keep anyone from suspecting the truth? Too many to count. The alien stepped away from the window and sank into a deep leather chair. He poured himself a glass of water from a crystal decanter and took a sip of the pleasant drink. On the table before him lay his winnings for the night. No more, no less, $800,000. Tony had given up $400,000, that's why he won. Patrick smiled. Humans were amusing creatures. So, willing to give up more than half of their potential winnings to a stranger in exchange for a simple tip. Ridiculous. And yet, it was on this very ridiculousness that his business was built. Patrick finished his water and idly twirled the glass in his hands. Everyone wants wealth and everyone has their own ways of achieving it. Some methods are not entirely legal. Some are outright dangerous. But that's just how the game is played. If you want to control the world, you have to give it something in return. Because everything in life follows the rules of the game. Kiev, April 27th, 2006.